Hello friends, thank you very much for joining me again. In this lesson 16 we finally discuss about the integration between a framework, an application framework, and a JPA implementation, Hibernate of course. And I know you have asked this for quite some time already and you've been patient with me. I told you it will be one of the last lessons of the playlist. Of course, we needed first to go through all the essentials of Hibernate, and the whole purpose of this playlist was to make you aware about the internals and to make you understand the philosophy of a JPA implementation, what ORM really is, and not only just learn to write some code but never understanding what's actually there. So the point is make you a real professional and understand not only how to solve a solution but why the code you wrote solved that solution. But it's time now to discuss about the integration between Spring and Hibernate, and I will create a Spring Boot project today. We're gonna discuss about Spring Data, and we have to think now about everything you've learned in the previous 15 lessons and try to see through the clouds of Spring Data that abstractizes everything, and understand that whatever you've learned in the past weeks with me here, it's exactly what's used behind the scenes. So this way, when you now use Spring Data JPA, you know exactly what happens there. You know it's a context, you know it's an entity manager. The entity manager executes different operations with this context, and at the end of the transaction the context is mirrored, and so on and so forth. If you are here with me, remember you have the live chat, so you can as usual ask me the questions in the live chat, and we can discuss on your questions. If you are not here with me but you are watching the event recorded later, you can still ask the questions in the comment section, and remember that you can always follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn and other social media. So what I was trying to do here is create the today's example. So you see I have selected here in my IntelliJ Spring initializer because I'm going to create a Spring Data project. And by the way, I have no idea actually if my database server is started. So let me check that. I'm using this sump and it's indeed off. So let me try to start it. Okay, here it is. So now we will also be able to really use a database if we want. Maybe it's a good idea. I'm also starting my SQL workbench to validate what we discussed behind the scenes. Okay, fine. So at Spring initializer name, I'm using Maven because I'm gonna go simple. Java, of course, Java 21 because it's the latest, even if the version you use now doesn't really affect us, so you could actually use 17 without any problem. And then let's just assume we create a web application and we want to connect to the database. That means, okay, here is the workbench, but I don't need it now. Okay, I'm gonna back. Web, I'm using a database, so I'm using MySQL, and I need to add the driver. Like you remember that in the previous lessons we had those 3 dependencies. If you don't remember, or if you feel you need a refresher, or maybe this is the first time you join me, this is the 16th video, so you might feel you have gaps if you have just joined. Just to remind to all the others, we were using like 3 dependencies. One was the Hibernate dependency, the other was the MySQL driver, which is the database JDBC driver. In my case, being I'm using MySQL, I do need to add the MySQL driver. And I was using also the Hikari connection pool, so that's why now I'm using MySQL driver, and I don't have to use the Hikari connection pool. Is the convention in Spring Boot, so automatically when I will add the MySQL driver, because it sees I'm going to use their database, will automatically add for me also the Hikari connection pool, so I don't have to mind about that. But yes, I do need to use JPA, and we said that today we work with Spring Data JPA. Now, one thing before we create a project, I want you to remember that Spring Data, it's not only Spring Data JPA. Many people many developers make confusions to consider that Spring Data and Spring Data JPA are equivalent, maybe because they have only seen Spring Data JPA, I don't know. The point is, Spring Data in general, when we talk about Spring Data, it's a larger, more extensive capability which offers you possibility to connect to your persistence layer in several ways, and not only to SQL but also to NoSQL persistence layers. So take a look a bit. If you look at the dependencies that Spring Data offers you, this is of course Spring Data JPA, which we are gonna check here, but at the same time you could have used the abstraction layer directly over JDBC. So now we use Spring Data JPA because this is a JPA playlist and that's what I'm teaching you. But normally it's not always you'll use Spring Data JPA, and of course it's not always Spring Data JPA would be the best solution for your application. Like in any other any other case, remember, when you think about the design or the architecture of a specific software product, you have to choose the dependencies according to many factors, and there is no silver bullet there. All of them have advantages and disadvantages, and if you've listened to me, you've heard probably me saying that plenty of times. Now, so you could go with Spring Data, which is, I'm gonna use a diagram soon to show you, which is an abstraction layer. But down below, under the abstraction, you might have Hibernate, which is what we discussed, but you might have directly JDBC. And in many cases, Spring Data JDBC is a solution to use over JPA. Actually, if you don't have the complexities of the relationships, and you don't care too much about them, or you work with transactions that operate over say larger amount of records, then using Spring Data JDBC would probably be a better choice than the JPA. And of course, it even offers you the possibility to use a reactive approach under the hood, so you can have the reactive JDBC and you can have the Spring Data abstraction over reactive JDBC and use Mono and Flux, considering that you are using Spring Reactive with the Reactor project behind the scenes. See, if you are using that, then most likely you'd like to have, of course, non-blocking operations at the database level as well, so you will not use either of the two, but you will use a reactive implementation. You can follow the Spring Reactive playlist if you want to know more about that. And of course, for a lot of the NoSQL options that you have out there, so you have for Redis, and usually for all of them you have two dependencies, the reactive and the non-reactive approach. So you can use Spring Data Redis non-reactively but also reactively, same with Mongo. Then you have Elasticsearch, Cassandra, Couchbase, and Neo4j. So Spring Data is not Spring Data JPA. That's what I want to conclude with. But now let's actually go further and create our project, because that's what we needed to do. Okay, it opened right here. I'm trying to drag the window to the screen that you can see as well. So here it is. And now load Maven project. Okay, and then I'm gonna go here and wait it to be indexed, and maybe the best is then while that happens, we discuss a little bit about the abstraction layer and what Spring Data really is. So a little bit off topic, but do you have anything planned on testing, something like a small series where you make small app? Well, yeah, why not? I don't necessarily have a plan at the moment, honestly. I'll finish this playlist and then I will think about what exactly to take next. But testing is also a very good option. Thank you for suggesting me that. So let's take a look a bit here. So you have the database. Now this is the database, and you decided to use JDBC. So if you decide to use JDBC, you already know what happens. So you have the JDBC layer, and then the JDBC layer here is directly used by the business layer of your application. So if I can go here and say, this is the business layer. This means the place where you implement the logic, okay? But then you have learned that you can actually have one other layer between this, which is your JPA implementation. So Hibernate. So you know that Hibernate uses JDBC further on to discuss with the database. And then this is basically everything we discussed since the first lesson where we talked about how to use Hibernate, that in the end uses, oh, here it is, the entity manager to deal with the context that mirrors at the end of the transaction, the context, and so on and so forth. So everything we discussed in this playlist is here. But you have also seen during our discussions and efforts to understand how Hibernate works and what JPA is in general as a specification, you have also seen that is rather uncomfortable sometimes to work with Hibernate, and there is a lot of boilerplate code you could actually avoid seeing, like the creation of the entity manager factory, the creation of the entity manager itself, starting, committing and closing the transaction under these resources. There are these things that you could actually somehow avoid at all. So why shouldn't we somehow find a way to make things a little bit more abstract? And frameworks, and in this case we discuss about Spring, usually come with such capabilities to help the developer to avoid writing the boilerplate code. So this is basically what Spring Data is. So Spring Data is nothing special in regards to the JPA it uses behind. So Spring Data, and here I'm referring specifically to Spring Data JPA because that's what we discussed today. So Spring Data JPA, it's only a way to hide the unnecessary to be seen code behind the scene. It's like having a normal application that uses Hibernate, but instead of letting you deal with all the Hibernate code, it simply just simplifies the communication between the app business layer and Hibernate. And that's what Spring Data is in general anyway. It only depends on what actually you have under it, because this is Spring Data JPA, no? But at the same time, you could have used Spring Data JDBC. If you would have used Spring Data JDBC, then the stack is a little bit shorter. So this is Spring Data JDBC. Okay? It simply directly uses JDBC, but makes it simpler to access. Okay? While in this case, it creates an app, it abstractizes the Hibernate implementation. So here you have a context, you have the entity manager, you have everything we discussed, and of course, being that you have all these, you can use criteria query, you can use JPQL, you can use entity graphs, and everything we discussed. While here, all the queries are native, you are only working with native queries, there is no context, is like creating your own prepared statements and working with them, just that you don't write all that code yourself, and instead of having to write a dozen of lines of code for a simple operation, you just write a query. And of course, you can now do the same with all the other cases. Like if you want, in case of Mongo, you have Spring Data Mongo and then the Mongo driver implementation. And of course, you don't have any JDBC driver because it's NoSQL. Okay, but what this is in a stack, so is a way to make things more abstract. Okay, this is Spring Data. So remember Spring Data, what is its scope, and hopefully you also understood the difference between Spring Data, JDBC, and JPA. Let me go to the hopefully already indexed project. You can see it here, fabulous. And now, do I actually have any database already? Let me check, because I'm just trying to start now my Workbench connection. Okay. Come on. Man, my computer decided to be slow today. Good. So what happens here? Oh, the something with authors. I think we've used this, but for some reason the connection didn't establish. I hope there is no problem with this. Connect to a database, and then okay. It tells me that the server is stopped. Didn't I just open it? I'm just gonna check that. If not, I'm gonna just write the code now. Indeed, it stopped. Crazy, isn't it? Okay. Okay, looks like it started now. Let's try another. And I'm connecting to the local. And while this starts, so entity manager and entity manager factory versus session and session factory. What should I use? What is the difference? Cool, very good question actually. So before Hibernate was actually before. Now it seems like my server stops for any reason. I don't know why. Anyway, I'm just gonna stop using this and that's it. So before. I was saying that Hibernate exists before the JPA specification, so it already started with a way of working, and the classes and the interfaces that it was using at that time were called session factory and session. So they still exist in Hibernate. You can search for them. They are all still there. But then what happened is that Hibernate. The JPA specification appeared, and Hibernate wanted to also fulfill the specification so it could have been reused in multiple projects. So it had to be in line with the newest specifications, with the newest Java EE at that time specifications. So what Hibernate did is it created these wrappers over session and session factory that already existed that implement the entity manager factory and the entity manager. So in other words, they are the same thing, but we do use the entity manager factory and the entity manager because they are basically there to adapt Hibernate to the JPA specification. I hope that makes sense for you. So both of them still exist. Entity manager factory and entity manager do use behind the scenes the session factory and the session types, but you will use the entity manager factory and the entity manager in general because you are going with the specification and not only with the implementation itself. Good. If that's clear, let me actually. So I don't know how to see what's in my database, to be honest with you, because it seems that when I try to connect to my database, it stops. So you see, it's open here now, and there are some glitches in the metrics here for me. Maybe I can try with IntelliJ. Do I have any MySQL here? Here it is. MySQL. And localhost, user and password, user root, no password, apply. Maybe this works. Maybe at least IntelliJ works. No drivers found. Oh my god. So what happens here? Access denied. Why for this user? Oh man, this is so. Okay, something seems to happen. Maybe. Anyway, no, sorry for that. I should have checked this before, but you know, friends, that I'm not usually preparing myself all the time for this live. But I'm gonna show you the code, so no worries. So normally, you already know that you have the normal entities. Okay, so the normal entities, like for example, let's say we have, I think I had last time the author entity. This is everything the same way we have already discussed it, so nothing special about it. You just use the already known annotations from the Jakarta persistence and you write the exactly same code. So everything that you have learned to use directly with Hibernate automatically will be possible to be used through Spring Data, because again, Spring Data JPA only creates an abstraction layer over Hibernate. It doesn't do anything else. So I'm gonna, for example, just create this normally. Say I have a generated value with auto increment, which means identity. And whatever I do have here doesn't really matter anymore, so I'm gonna just leave the ID because I don't remember. I don't even know if I have the table, but maybe. And I do remember that the table was actually from last time was called authors, I think. So I should put the table annotation here as well. Okay, here it is. So then when I create the layer of the application that connects to a database, then this is usually called a repository layer. And the funny thing is that the only thing I need to do actually is to create an interface to work with a specific entity. And this interface will be automatically implemented behind the scenes. So how does that work? Well, I do invite you to watch the Spring playlist entirely if you want to find out the magic behind the scenes, because it would definitely be too difficult for me to explain it right now. But through some dynamic proxies, the application framework implements, and based only on some configuration you give, it integrates only the things that are changeable in the code that would be actually considered boilerplate code. So it provides the code that you would not need to write yourself, that you don't need to see, because it doesn't define the things that represent the real actions you do with the persistence, and it integrates what you configure in that code so that you don't see that code. So for example, for me, it would only be author repository, for example, and then normally here you need to for Spring to know that this is an interface designed to represent a Spring Data repository. You need to extend the Spring Data type. This way, Spring knows how to dynamically implement this interface, and that means that you at least have to oops, not this one, but this one. You have to at least extend the repository contract from Spring Data. Repository contract is the higher repository in the hierarchy. Spring Data separates multiple interfaces. It segregates them according to the interface segregation principle from Solid, and it allows you this way to select what exactly operations you'd want to inherit out of the box. So the repository interface is actually a marker interface. It doesn't define any operation. So if you go with it, you will be able to create a Spring Data repository, but you will inherit literally nothing, meaning that everything you define should be defined by you in the interface itself. So they have the type and the ID, which in my case means author, the entity, and integer, the ID type, and that's it. And then with this one, now if you really want to create something, you just need to say author, for example, find author by something. I only have the ID now, but as an idea, it could be any combination. And you can do it like that. And now, based on the method name, the application framework creates behind the scenes the select a from author a, where a ID is and the parameter you have given. So in the comment is the JPQL that you would have written yourself. And now you can call it, and it will basically work if you try to call it. A lot of other comments, so let me see if I can help with them. A lot of thank yous. I'm very happy to see that. Appreciate your thank yous, guys. Yeah, just it would have been a good idea, but I should have started from the beginning with it. Is JavaX and Jakarta packages will have the same feature? So Jakarta basically is the future of JavaX. So with Jakarta, with Java E8, if I correctly remember, I hope I'm not wrong, it happened in 2019 when Oracle open sourced Java EE. It had to change the name, so it changed the name in Jakarta. So basically it is the same thing, but you can't say there are the same features because like it's different versions. It's like asking, is Java 17 has Java 17 the same thing, sorry, or is Java 17 the same thing as Java 8? No, of course not. Java is the same, but Java 17 has definitely more features than Java 8 because it's a new version. So imagine Jakarta is just, they changed the name, but it's also the evolution of Java EE itself. So depending on what version you choose, it might have differences. Now, it doesn't really matter because now we only use Jakarta because it's the only name for what we previously knew as Java EE. Okay. Any advice for a beginner diving into Spring Framework? Yeah, of course. I mean, why don't you actually start with, for example, the playlist here on this channel? If you are here for the first time, you might be happy to find out that there is a full playlist for Spring. So now I'm not teaching you Spring with this specific video. I'm just trying to clarify questions like what is Spring Data JPA over Hibernate. But of course, learning how to use it, I would recommend you go to the Spring playlist for that. It's free on this channel, it will always be, so try with that. And of course, you can also start with the book I wrote, Spring Start Here. Many people had good feedback about it, so you might find it good for you as well. So now, can we write a query with a field name in another related class? Field name in another related class in author. I'm not sure what that means. So normally what you can do, maybe we are referring to a relationship or something, but no, now I was telling you, let me continue with my explanation, because maybe it also clarifies. So there are a few things you need to know. So I started by telling you that you only write the method name, and then it automatically understands what kind of query it should create behind the scenes. But what I want to tell you is that you shouldn't do that in a real world application, okay? So, because normally, yeah, when you think about select a from author A where ID is ID, okay, that's fine. No, it's not such a long name. But imagine you have a query that takes a few lines. How would that method name look like? Horrible, no? It would look horrible, very long, hard to read. So what I do actually is I always recommend developers to not rely on the method name, but always use the query annotation above it, like that. And remember that starting with Java 17, you can use the text blocks, which will allow you to easily read and write any query. So if you have multiple things, say and something, then you can put it on multiple lines and it still looks pretty nice. But I never rely in a real world application only on the name of the method. I always, even for the simpler queries, just use the query, because it's also, once you've learned SQL and JPQL, it's always easier for a developer to read the query rather than try to understand from the method name what happens. And this way you are pretty much sure you don't make mistakes. Another thing you should remember is that you can always consider if the author is or not mandatory. So if I keep the method like this and the author doesn't exist, it will return a null. And you do remember that we try to avoid using nulls, no, in return as return values or as parameters. So what does that mean is that you can actually replace it with optional of author, okay? And it will automatically know, in this case, to return you an empty optional or an optional containing the right instance in case you need it. So the recommendation is, if you know that this query might not return a value, then it's recommended you use an optional and then you treat it accordingly in wherever you use it. So it forces you, where you call this method now, to specify what happens when the author doesn't exist, which is exactly what optional tries to do since it was first time introduced in Java 8. So what about Spring Microservices playlist? Why would we link Spring to microservices? I never understood that. So microservices, it's an architectural style, and by definition it has a very important characteristic named polyglottism. So that means microservices, by definition, they come with the possibility of allowing use of a variety of technologies. And it would be basically an anti-pattern to force microservices architecture use only Spring. So what I actually mean is that, is Spring microservices a good idea, or would it actually make people believe that whenever you have a microservice architecture you should make it with Spring always, which is not the case. But I think that's the subject for another discussion. How to generate the dynamic query? Well, that's a very good question, but I have already explained it like a couple of lessons ago. So look, if you need a refresher on that, somewhere in lesson 12 or 13, we discussed criteria query, and I explained, or I tried to explain in details how to do that. So you can always go back on this channel, find the lesson and review it. Good. Let's and now further. So of course, in case you have something that provides more than one value, so like a list of authors, you can use list, set, or collection as a return type, no? And again, it knows how to do that, so you can say find all authors, and then you define the query here, and that's it. Yeah, that's all the authors. And normally, if you want to have simple operations such as this one, then the recommendation is you don't have to like make them yourself. But instead of using the repository, which is the top level interface, you can use an interface that extends from this one. And for example, you have CRUD repository as an alternative. If you go to CRUD repository, you will see that it does the same thing. It extends repository that we previously extended. So now you don't directly extend repository, but you extend repository through the CRUD repository contract, which gives you everything that CRUD repository already defines. And you will see that there are plenty of basic methods. So the point is, if what you want is having already basic methods such as find by ID, which is one of the examples I've previously started with, then you don't necessarily have to define them yourself. You can actually extend CRUD repository, and then you can have your interface absolutely empty, because if you don't define anything else more custom, then you can directly use those that are here in the CRUD repository. And of course, then any specific technology might come with their own contract. So for example, there is JPA repository, which is, as the name suggests, specific to JPA, and for it you will find already things that that provide or come with a collection, which makes things easier to use. Okay, so the point is, you will always extend an interface that at some point in the end extends the top repository, and this is the way in which Spring knows what to implement. But then you can already extend an interface that provides you with some methods that are specific to a given technology. For example, flush. Flush, it's an operation that only makes sense with an entity manager. It only makes sense with a context. You flush the context, no? Or merge, I think it might have here merge as well. No, it doesn't have, but anyway. So the point is, when you have things that are common to a specific, you might find a given repository for that. Okay, so that's the idea. And normally you will very likely find JPA repository as being extended when working with JPA. Now you can do all the other things. So you can use criteria query, but if you want to use criteria query, you have to directly inject the entity manager, which is possible in any application framework, and in Spring you can do that with the auto-wired notation. Or you can use JPQL very simply through Spring Data like that, in case you don't need something more complex. Anyway, remember, criteria query, it's something that adds a certain level of complexity, and you know that because we have discussed it together in the previous lessons. I do not recommend you use that unless you really need that. I've seen at some point a project that only used criteria query, and it really used criteria query for things like getting all the values of a table or where something. But remember that to write criteria query that gives you that, it's quite a few lines of code. So you might end up writing 10-15 lines of code only for that. And if you go into that direction, you will end up with a lot of code. And point is that normally our target is to minimize the code we write, not to maximize it. We want to write as few lines of code as possible to implement the same thing. So just doing that with criteria query because you want to have criteria query in the whole place in the application doesn't really make sense. I mean, you always choose, and I'm going to say it again, any tool has downsides and upsides. There is no silver bullet, meaning that even when you take criteria query versus JPQL is still easy and makes sense to use. Criteria query, it's more complex and makes sense to use, but only in certain cases, like when you have to dynamically create the query itself. Okay, so don't go into overcomplicating, into over-engineering your application. And going back to the question about the relationship, now I'm not sure whether you can write a method name that also finds in a relationship, if that was the question. Why I don't know that? Because I never use that, because I never recommend using something like that. So yes, if you have a relationship, you will always be able to provide it through your query, through your JPQL, the way we have already discussed in the previous lessons. And that's what I recommend you do, because I don't want to forget to answer your question. So most likely you would be able to do that through the method name as well. But I'd never recommend you do that, especially when you have joins, especially when you have to deal with relationships. Anytime your query is large, please do use the query annotation. And if it is for my advice, I would actually use the query annotation literally always. Okay, methods that return iterable. Iterable is an interface that represents an iterator collection, so it's basically a collection. Why are they like that instead of collection? I think the guys just wanted to go a little bit more abstract. I don't think they had any other reason for choosing iterator instead of collection. And yeah, I think that's it. So I don't want to go any further. Again, the purpose of this lesson was not to teach you how to use Spring Data, because I already have lessons about that in the Spring playlist, and normally I shouldn't even go into having the aspiration of teaching you Spring Data unless you know the basics of Spring, and you know better if you are there or not. But I wanted to clarify Spring Data JPA versus what we've made. So whatever we learned in the previous lesson is to know what's behind the scenes. Whenever you will start using Spring Data, you will see some abstract things, but behind the scenes there is still the context, and there are still the operations of the entity manager over that context. And normally you should understand what things are behind the scenes, so that you don't have that mentality of JDBC instead of you having the JPA itself. So that's basically how it should go. Pagination and filtering, yes, but there are already, as an example, in the Spring playlist. So again, I don't want to go in any more details because I would need a playlist for that. But the playlist is already there. You have it with examples in the Spring playlist. You can find there also the pagination and the filtering as well. With that being said, friends, thank you very much for being here with me. And I hope that you that things are more clear now on Spring Data versus Hibernate versus JPA. But of course, I'm still looking forward to your questions in the comment section. And until next time we meet again, thank you everyone, waving goodbye, and have an excellent time for learning. Cheers.